Okay, everybody, real quickly, it'll be a short demo, but I want to introduce you to a new tool in your Maya toolkit that you may find useful with this first assignment, kind of wrapping it up, and you may find it useful later on with some of your more complex models. So we've been working with just plain, simple, primitive objects that you create from this menu, and you've been going in and maybe increasing the number of subdivisions to change the shape and form, or maybe doing some squash and stretch with scaling to reshape those forms a little bit. And that's all well and good, but sometimes you want to be able to do more than that. Now we will get into actually manipulating the geometry of these individual shapes. But for right now, I want to keep that geometry intact the way it is and show you a new way or a way to kind of deform these and reshape those without getting into the geometry. So I've got just a basic sphere loaded. I'm in the modeling interface in Maya. If I go to the deform menu, I have a list of different kind of deformations that I can apply to an object. The one we're going to pay attention to right here is the lattice. So if you select lattice, what happens is it creates this box that surrounds the entire object. Okay, so this object that I had selected is now contained inside this three-dimensional lattice. And what happens is you see it's got the same manipulators, so I can move, and it moves the lattice and the contained object in whatever direction. I can rotate, same thing, and I can scale, and it still affects it the same. Okay. And you'll notice over here when the lattice is created and selected, so when it's selected it's in green. Over here in your channel box, which you should be pretty familiar with now, I can tell the lattice is what I'm working on because it's on FFD2 lattice. Everything you create in Maya will be given a name. You can rename things, but by default this is those kind of naming convention for a lattice. If I click, I can still click on the object and select it. I can move it. When I move it though, it moves it outside of the lattice. We don't want to do that. We want to keep it in there because we want to deform it, and anything inside the boundaries of the lattice will be deformed. So what I'm going to do is I want to work with I want to kind of disregard the object itself and work on the lattice. Okay. So the way that works is I'll select it by clicking on it. What I want to do is everywhere these divisions intersect on the planes, it creates a point. So if I click or right click on the lattice, you'll see this pop up. What that is, that's just like a selection pop up. In object mode, that means I'm going to select the entire object, in this case the lattice. So I can click on it and it selects everything. Sometimes I want that. Sometimes I want to, though, be able to select the lattice points. When I click there, right click and drag to that, you'll see this changes to a blue line with magenta points. Now what I can do is I can select a point, and if I click on that point, what's going to happen is, first of all, you'll see me click on it on one side, and in the X view, on the X plane, you'll see it select the opposite version of that point. It's the symmetry is turned on, and so what that allows is I can click on one side on the X and it will select the opposite point. So then what happens is when I select that and drag, you can see it will start to deform that shape. The other thing to notice is see how close these points are to this part of the shape? That's a pretty heavy influence it's having on it. If I select these points that are further away, see the distance between here and the shape, and select those, it's much less pronounced. Okay, so proximity of these points to the object also influences how it deforms it. But what I can do with this is I can go in and I can select multiple points on the lattice, drag them, and reshape them. And really quickly, I've got something that looks in profile a lot more like a skull. Like if I'm modeling a human character or an animal character or anything, I can do some deformation here and get something that looks and reads a little more like a skull to start with than just your plain old ordinary sphere. I haven't added any geometry. I haven't changed any. I'm just deforming it based on moving the points of this lattice around. Okay. Okay. So right now you're seeing the lattice in all four views. Let's say I want to work in these three views and edit the lattice, but I just want to use this top right view to tumble and see my shape from all sides. That lattice gets in the way. So if I don't want to see that, and you'll notice in each panel there's a show menu. If I click on show, it'll show you all the things that you're viewing inside this window. So if I go in and find deformers and uncheck that, that lattice is now hidden. Okay, and then if, say I didn't want the grid, can I turn the grid off? Down at the bottom, I can turn the grid off so I don't have to be bothered by that if I don't want it. If I want them back on, I go to show and just turn them back on. So you can kind of streamline your view to make it easier, more comfortable to work. All right. But see, we've taken just a plain old ordinary sphere and we've now kind of shaped it into a skull just by playing around with these deformers and moving some shapes. Okay, so the thing is, there's still on this deformer, on this lattice, not a lot of points. So we can't make a lot of really big or really subtle changes. Everything is a fairly big change. If I select that and drag it, it moves a whole lot of that object. Okay, what if I just want to have a little more finer control on this object? Like right now, I don't have any points in the middle, so I couldn't go in and select the middle of this and kind of bring it out a little bit. So what I've got to do is I got to think of that before I create my lattice. Basically, you can't add new divisions to a lattice once you've made tweaks to it, and I believe that's what they're called, is tweaks. So how do I do that then? I've already done this much. What's going to happen is I'm going to have to go back and undo all this. So if I go to the deform menu and under the edit section with the lattice selected, if I go to edit and lattice and reset lattice, it resets it to its original creation point that I did when I created it. And you can see it, the sphere resets to whatever it was. Now I'm going to go back to object mode. In the channel box, I'll see that I've got my lattice selected. I'll see shapes. These divisions, let's go ahead and make those 4. And you'll see it adds more divisions on that axis. And let's do 4. Let's go ahead, instead of 5 on that one, let's make that 4 so we have an even number around all sides. So now we've given ourselves more points that we can select. Okay, but what we've also done is we've kind of changed the way a point influences the original geometry. With more points, it has less influence over the geometry. So if I click this one and drag it down, I'm getting a smoother kind of deformation there. I've got a lot more control over it, more fidelity over it, so I can reshape these a little bit better. And it's got a smoother shape, and it just looks cleaner and neater. And there's like a point at which you can have too many points and really get in the weeds with this. So you kind of have to figure out how to use this tool if you're going to use it much. Sometimes too many points is too many points. Okay, let's say I want to bring the head up a little bit. It's become this kind of egg shape, so what I might need to do is grab this middle here and drag it down. And again, you're seeing this manipulator on one side, but it's affecting both sides. That's because symmetry is turned on. So anything I select, and the symmetry is set for the X uh, axis. So anything I select on the X axis, it will select the negative point there, and I can move those. And I can just drag and select multiple points over the top. But the more points we have in the lattice, the more we can start to really reshape this. Like maybe we need a muscle shape. We could go in and start to kind of build something that looks more like musculature, and then start to layer that object on top of another object. But this is a good way to kind of work with your primitive shapes and play around and deform them a little bit and get a little more out of them than their default shape. Okay, so that works on a sphere. Let's go ahead and show you another example. Oh, I want to delete it. What I've got to do is I've got to select the lattice in object mode. Then I should be able to hit delete. It will then leave the original sphere. I'll go ahead and delete that. Let's go ahead and create a simple box cube in here. Okay, it's simple. The minimum number of faces or divisions or polygons, I guess. It's a six-sided cube. If I create with it selected a lattice deformer, you can see it pretty much fits the cube exactly. Okay, and this has 5 divisions here. So if I right click and do lattice point, I can select that guy and move him. Okay, excuse me. You'll see it shifts this entire edge. Okay, there's no control enforced by these 3 points on the lattice. That's because there are no points in between. There's no divided geometry in here. Okay, so if I go back and select this guy, drag it, nothing. Because these influence the points of your geometry of your actual shape. Okay, so the only ones that are going to actually do anything on this are the corner points. To remedy that, I'll click on the box. Over here in the channel box, I'll see this switch to P cube 1. That's the name of this cube. And I know that I can go to its input, which now also shows the containing lattice and any tweaks made to that lattice. I can select polycube and I can increase the subdivisions to 4, 4, 4. Now I've got more geometry in this shape to work with. Okay, now when I go back and select the lattice, and sometimes I need to watch where these lines are to make sure I'm selecting the lattice and not the object. Again, the way you can tell is by whatever is highlighted over here. So I've got the lattice. If I select, the lattice and lattice point, if I grab this guy, I can move that. And now I can kind of create and move the points around and create a much more complex shape, because there's more points there for it to deform. Now it's still got some pretty chunky and hard edge deformations here. Let's say I want this to be smoother. What I've got to do then is I need more points in my lattice. So what I'll do is with the lattice selected on object mode, I'll go back and deform and lattice, reset lattice, And then I'll add more divisions here too. So let's go 4 and 4 and 4. And I'll select it and do right click lattice point. And I get a little bit more. Or there's a little more control here. I'm starting to get some deformations on the side. But what I can also do is I can go back to the cube and give it more geometry. And now I'll have more to work with on these lattice points. So you're starting to see a little more smoothness there, and things will start to round out and not be so kind of rigid. Okay, so really what it is, it's a lot about how much geometry you've got in your shape, and if I extend this more, you'll see this starts to become round at the end. And we're going to learn how to really adjust the geometry of individual objects. That's going to be the biggest part of what we do in Maya, is moving points around and adding geometry and moving geometry. But so now I've taken this really simple cube and just kind of reshaped it. And sometimes you can break it, like that kind of breaks it. So you've got to be careful and not push these too far still. All right. So that's the quick demo of this. Just kind of play around with these. And again, it's just another tool for you all to use. Right, so and again, what that basically is you start with nothing. You add your shape, or you could take your existing shape in your existing model. Let's say you've modeled an animal and you want to now play around with the skull with one sphere instead of maybe you've got 2 or 3 joined together, kind of mashed together. Now you can take one and create a new sphere and play around, and it's deform lattice. And again, the more divisions you have, the finer the control over that shape. And sometimes you want really fine control. Sometimes it can be a curse, though. Sometimes with just as few divisions as possible, you can get the basic shape you're after. So that's one of those balancing acts you've got to kind of figure out. Okay, so that's it for this demo. I encourage you to play around and just, load up some shapes and play with the deformers, and then maybe get back into your Project 1 model and see if there are ways that you could maybe take a sphere and deform it to have a more complex version of a shape you were shooting for. All right, and it'll work on all of these, again, all of these primitives. It's just, you got to think about how much subdivision you have in each one. All right, thanks.